By the time the Union flames reached Vicksburg, the Belgrave estate had already closed its iron gates. Most of Mississippi's grand homes were gutted by war. Porches scorched to bone, windows smashed under rifle butts, fields salted to ash. But Belgrave's house never caught fire. It stood at the edge of a hollowed-out town, pristine and whole, flanked by skeletal sycamores and guarded by silence. The porch rails were polished, the roof was resealed, and above the white door hung a new placard, St. Aurelius Medical Refuge. No price listed, no hours posted. Just an open door and the smell of lye. They said the Union spared it out of mercy, but no one could remember who made that decision. They said the freedmen were welcome there, yet none of their families had seen them again once admitted. Fields nearby grew quiet. Mail routes curved around it. The road leading to the main gate was never muddy, always swept even in rain. Livestock never grazed past its fence line. Birds avoided the attic windows. A Union-appointed inspector, Enoch Halverston, was assigned to survey the growing list of postbellum facilities claiming to serve the injured poor. St. Aurelius was at the top of that list, not for excellence, but for the number of names it had absorbed without record. 37 patients in the first year, mostly men with amputated limbs or head wounds from the war. 13 black children from freed families, all listed under recovery. 5 women noted only as postpartum hysteria. None discharged, none buried, no complaints ever filed. Only whispers, usually drowned in church bells or the rustling of winter cane. Halverston rode in under weak sun with a federal badge and a gut full of dread. He'd visited prisons and plague wards. He'd walked through trenches days after battle, seen rats chew the faces off men still moaning. But nothing about Belgrave's place felt like aftermath. It felt paused, preserved. The front steps were dry. The floorboards didn't creak. Each shutter was angled the same. Even the leaves beneath the sycamores looked placed, not fallen. A boy opened the door for him. Not a servant, not a nurse. Just a pale boy in pressed linen, no shoes, with wax around his fingernails. The boy said nothing. Inside it smelled of boiled cloth and something older, like sour meat behind soap. Hallways ran too straight, ceilings were too low. No patients were visible, only the sound of bed sheets shifting behind walls and an occasional bell chime, though no one explained who rang it. Halverston asked for Dr. Belgrave and was told the doctor was in deep reflection, a phrase repeated by every white uniformed aide like scripture. They offered tea. He declined. They offered a tour. He accepted. They started with the nursery. There were no cribs, no sound, just small beds made tight with ropes instead of sheets. Some of the headboards had thin straps nailed into them, frayed and crusted with brown. In one corner sat a bassinet lined with tin rusted black where water had pooled. A broken mobile of wire hooks spun slowly despite the still air. In the east wing, they showed him the convalescent's garden, a sunroom lined with potted mint and fogged glass. No wheelchairs, no walking sticks, just a row of benches with faint grooves on the seatbacks. The kind made when someone is pressed down over time. On one bench was a leather belt, not medical but uniform grade. It had initials carved into it, DRS, and a crust of what looked like dried yolk along the inside. Halverston noted every detail in his ledger but found no staff records to compare. When he asked for the patient list, they gave him a scroll of names, all written in the same hand. ink still fresh on the bottom few. Some names matched those he carried from Union hospitals, but the dates were off. Some marked deceased before the war had even ended. Others marked as reversed, a status not found in any federal code. In the West Wing, the nurse who led him, a tall woman with a limp she refused to explain, offered to show him the procedure rooms. He declined. Something about the hinges on those doors looked repainted too recently. Instead, he asked to see the burial grounds. She hesitated, then smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "We don't bury here," she said. "Recovery is our tradition." That night, Halverston didn't leave. A sudden storm had made the roads too slick, they claimed. His horse was given feed and tied in the back. He was offered a guest room, white linens, sealed windows, and a key that didn't fit the door it was meant for. The mattress was too soft. The pillow was warm when he laid his head on it. Around midnight, he heard a sound beneath the floor. Not pipes, not rodents, not footsteps. Something slower, rhythmic, like breath being drawn through a reed. He stood, pressed his hand to the floorboards, and felt it. A pulse. Long, steady, far below. Not like the beat of a heart, like the pull of lungs. In the morning, his clothes were pressed, waiting. His journal had been read. 2 pages torn clean, no mess left behind. His boots were shined. His horse stood exactly where he left it, but its eyes were wrong. Wide, white. As he rode out, the nurse waved from the porch, the same smile on her lips. Behind her, the boy stood still, his hands clasped. Wax on his nails. Something dark behind his ears. The placard over the door looked brighter now, as if it had been cleaned. The house never burned. Not in wartime, not in sickness, not in inspection. It was a house that kept what it was given, and Mississippi kept giving. The road back to town felt longer. Too long. Something about the sky had changed. No clouds, but the air still smelled of smoke. And behind him he thought he heard it again. That breath, that slow, rising pull. Dr. Aldrich Belgrave did not limp, though he had supposedly walked the length of Vicksburg's dead with a tourniquet in one hand and a bone saw in the other. He had no burn scars, though he'd been credited with entering firebombed homes to retrieve the injured. He had no tremor, no cough, no night terrors. There were no notes, no journals, no receipts of war, and yet the state called him a miracle worker. They called him the gentle scalpel. The papers said he saved hundreds of soldiers, north and south, and turned his own estate into a hospital before the last shots had even been fired. But none of the men ever came forward. No survivors with stumps or stitched chests, no amputees with a word of thanks, no nurses, no wards, no names. Just Belgrave, clean and tall, and a building that grew quieter with each patient it welcomed. The inspector returned with a second badge, one stamped by federal authority, not just state curiosity. This time he asked for the grounds, not the halls, not the nurse-prepared rooms, but the land itself, the outbuildings, the sheds, the cellars beneath the carriage road. The nurse hesitated, then handed him a ring of keys and walked away without speaking. The map she left on the table was hand-drawn. The ink had faded where her palm had pressed it too long. Only 2 buildings were marked beyond the house, a chapel and a barn. The chapel sat pristine and locked. The barn did not. It was not a place meant for grain or horses. Its rafters were low and splintered. Hooks jutted from beams in unnatural intervals. Not high enough for storage, too low for slaughter. There were rusted lengths of iron nailed along the walls with bolts the size of fists. Beneath the hay and mildew, the floor was grooved in rows, not from wheels or plows, but something dragged repeatedly over time. In one corner, a wooden seat was nailed to the floor, armrests gouged by fingernails. A leather strap dangled from the ceiling above it, its loop charred at the edge. Halverston ran his hand along the grain of the wall. One knot gave, a door within a door. Behind it, a stairwell descended into soil, and the air thickened. The first few steps were packed with salt, as if to ward rot, but it did nothing to stop the smell. The cellar walls were lined with narrow alcoves, each no wider than a child's shoulders. Most were empty. The third was not. She sat slumped forward, knees drawn tight, head tilted as if listening. Her skin was the color of wax, but not the cold kind. More like old parchment that had been written on and then scraped clean. Her lips were not visible. Instead, thick black sutures puckered her mouth closed in a clumsy X, as if whoever did it had run out of thread halfway through and finished with twine. Her eyes were open. One was milked over. The other stared directly at him. She made no sound, not even breath. But when he stepped forward, her hands moved, slow, deliberate. She touched her throat, then her left wrist, then lifted her palm and turned it toward him. In the center was a scar in the shape of a horseshoe, burned deep and warped. A brand, not of ownership, but of procedure. He had seen it once before, in a prisoner's file marked confidential. It was used to mark those who had undergone experimental venting, a Civil War-era theory that trauma could be relieved by bleeding through a targeted wound. The procedure had been outlawed for causing fatal seizures. The theory was born in a Confederate medical camp near Chattanooga. The man who proposed it vanished after the war. His name was Aldrich Belgrave. She blinked once, then slumped again. Halverston reached to touch her shoulder, but the air between them felt wrong. Too hot, too dry. He stepped back. The door had not closed, but he heard the latch anyway. He took photographs. He wrote down every detail. But when he returned to the main building and asked to see the doctor, he was told again, "Doctor, Belgrave is in reflection." He asked where the records were kept. The nurse stared blankly. "There are no records. Mercy doesn't need ink." In the days that followed, Halverston traced the scar through state archives, finding fragments, old death reports from the field, cases signed under false names, soldiers listed as emotionally emptied. He found one mention in a Confederate trial log from 1865, stating a witness had died mid-testimony after claiming a doctor had replaced his breath with the sound of bells. The term used was ritual stress pacification. The witness's tongue had been removed post-mortem. The doctor's name was redacted. The silence of Belgrave's house grew heavier. The inspector returned to the barn at dusk and found the cellar door sealed with nails. He pried it open, but the girl was gone. In her place on the dirt wall behind the alcove, a single handprint in blood remained. Beside it, drawn in ash, were 5 dots in a line. Morse. He wrote it down and decoded it that night. It read, "Still down here." The methods were not random. The restraints in the barn weren't made to punish. They were designed to hold precisely, to silence spasms, to guide breath, to separate the moment of pain from the moment of death. This wasn't madness. This was rehearsed cruelty thought through. Each death, if it had occurred, would have been timed. controlled, and worse, hidden beneath a system that no longer knew what it permitted. Belgrave had no wounds because he never fought. He had no scars because he never bled. He stood apart, the still point around which all torment circled. He didn't heal. He harvested. He didn't cure. He corrected. And every soul that entered his care was stripped clean of name, voice, and breath. The inspector slept less. When he did, he dreamed of rooms with no corners, beds with no bodies, and mouths sewn shut, not with thread, but with intention. He dreamed of someone watching, not angrily, but curiously, with the patience of a man waiting for an answer he already knew. And every time he woke, there was one sound beneath the floorboards. Not mice, not wind, just the slow pull of something learning to breathe again. The smell was always strongest in the eastern corridor, behind the locked doors no one ever touched. Not decay exactly, but something older than rot, like scorched paper and the shallow scent of wet limestone. The nurse called it the furnace wing, though no smoke ever rose from its chimney. The doors were barred, not bolted. Inside, the inspector was told, were records. Fragile things untouched by war, needing protection from the damp. When he pressed his hand to the knob, it vibrated once, faint and cold. He did not ask again until the preacher arrived. Reverend Sampson Hale had been summoned by the local parish council to assess the estate's spiritual condition. Rumors had spread too wide, of unnatural quiet, of a child seen walking backward in the fields at dusk, of hymns sung in wrong keys behind stained glass that had never been installed. He was a tall man, stooped only by grief, not age. He had buried more men than he baptized, and his sermons often drifted into silence where words had failed him. When he stepped into the Belgrave estate, the air seemed to recoil. The nurse met him with a twisted smile. The doctor was once again in reflection. The preacher asked for nothing. He carried only a small communion kit and a book with pages loose from use. He read from it that morning at the foot of the chapel. Not inside, for the door would not open, but beside a bent sycamore speaking to the wind. The inspector watched from a distance. Behind the preacher in the high attic window, the boy with waxed fingernails stood still. When the bread and wine were raised, the sun dimmed slightly as if something had stepped in front of it. That night the preacher stayed for supper but did not eat. He asked to see the records. The nurse hesitated only a moment, then offered to take him. The inspector followed, claiming interest in the archive. They were led to the eastern corridor. The furnace doors were open now. The room beyond was not filled with paper. It was stone, floors, walls, even the ceiling layered in chalk dust white. In the center was a grate embedded into the floor, scorched around the edges. Chains hung from the ceiling, not suspended but taut, anchored to the ground as if something once struggled upward. Along one wall was a table. Upon it lay a ledger bound in human hide. The writing inside was backward, mirrored in Latin, the ink flaking and red. The inspector held it to the glass and read aloud phrases that made the preacher wince. Extracted regret through oral cavity. Breath-slowed resurrection. Calcium-fed clarity. Treatments were labeled by sin. Patients numbered by whisper. One entry had a name, the only one, Reverend S. Hale, dated the morning of his arrival. Method, inversio crucis, locus terrae. He turned to ask who had written it, but the nurse was gone. So was the hall behind them. The air grew hotter. From below the grate, a low moan rose like steam. They left the ledger. The preacher left the estate that evening with shaking hands. He spoke no word, only gripped the communion case as if it had weight. That night, Halverston dreamed of burning ropes and the smell of teeth ground into chalk. When he woke, the preacher was gone. His wagon remained. The horse stood where it had been tied. His shoes were under the guest bed. His collar folded neatly on the chair. It took 3 days to find the passage. Beneath the furnace room was a chamber unmarked on any map. The door was not hidden, only forgotten, tucked behind a stack of firewood too dry to burn. The key fit, though it had never been used. Inside was silence, thick and unnatural. The walls were lined with wooden frames shaped like crosses but inverted. Beneath each one was a shallow pit lined with lime and smoothed stone. The wood was splintered, but not from nail, from movement. Worn grooves showed where wrists had twisted, where knees had buckled and heads had struck forward. One cross still held something. The body was face down, arms outstretched, legs buckled beneath. The chin was nailed into a block of wood. The skin of the back was peeled in thin layers, exposing muscle beneath powder white. The bones had been tapped hollow, carefully with small punctures and scorched edges. The inspector stepped closer. The mouth was open against the wood, but the tongue had been removed. In its place was a bundle of twine and ash, tied in the shape of a chalice. The air was hot near the body, too hot. The floor beneath steamed with invisible heat. Beside the pit was a bucket of lye and an iron ladle. One wall bore scratch marks in a wide curve, as if a face had been dragged back and forth for hours. On the ceiling was a symbol, a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines. The same symbol carved into the communion case. This was no act of rage. It was designed, calculated, religious inversion as a form of correction. The doctor had built an altar from pain and turned confession into suffering. The method was cruel not just in design but in duration. The body's position allowed slow exhalation while preventing full breath. Heat from below dried the lungs. The lime scraped raw nerves. The nailed chin silenced any scream. Death came not from trauma, but from time. The inspector returned to his room that night, but did not sleep. The floor tapped beneath him, not rats, not pipes, measured a pattern. He listened until morning. It repeated every 13 seconds, like breath being learned. He did not record the body in his report. He knew the church would not claim it. He burned the ledger page with the preacher's name, but kept the rest. Belgrave's methods were not about healing. They were about obedience, a reshaping of soul through flesh. He didn't believe in sin as failure. He believed in sin as signal. Every patient was a message, every death a paragraph. The doctor had no sermon, only procedure, and it was being written into skin. The inspector stopped asking for the doctor. He knew now where he lived, not in the rooms above, but below, in the hollows where sound bent and the dead did not decompose. Belgrave was not a man with patience. He was a man with a purpose. And the hospital was not a refuge. It was a scripture. Outside, the sun broke through for the first time in weeks. But it did not warm the soil. The boy with waxed fingers stood beneath the sycamore again, watching. This time he was smiling. The woman who came to the estate at dusk had once worn its uniform. Her hands shook too much to knock, so she waited by the gate until the inspector crossed the threshold. returning from the marsh with soil still on his boots. She called his name, not loudly but in a whisper that carried. Her skin was paper pale. Her sleeves were rolled long even in the heat. He recognized her from a list he hadn't shared with anyone. A nurse dismissed without reason, name erased from payroll, never declared missing, never buried. The locals called her Magda, the name given to her after she'd been found wandering downriver barefoot with half her scalp missing and wax pressed into the corners of her eyes to hold them open. She had not spoken since then, until now. She said she had seen herself opened like scripture, and Belgrave had made her read her own insides aloud. That night the inspector brought her into town and sat with her by oil lamp. She did not eat. She only spoke of one room. A chamber with 7 mirrors, each tall and narrow, arched like church windows, none fixed to the walls. They moved. They spun. They followed movement like eyes. The floor was tilted, the tables low. The walls were padded not for silence but for absorption, so that the last thing heard was not a scream but breath echoing back against the glass. Belgrave called it the reflection suite. She called it the hell of knowing. Women deemed womb wild were brought there. Women who bled too long, screamed too often, or wept without cause. Belgrave believed the womb could wander not just through the body but through the soul, unanchored by obedience. He devised a treatment meant not to heal but to humiliate the womb into submission. Each woman was sedated just enough to remain awake. Belladonna for lucidity, vinegar swabbed under the tongue to keep it sharp. The cuts began just below the ribcage. Slow, deliberate, symmetrical, the kind of incisions used in autopsies, except here they were practiced on the living. Magda had been an assistant once. She had held the hooks. She had steadied the heads. The first woman they tested died after 12 minutes. Her jaw shattered from biting down on the strap. Belgrave had called it a failure of spirit, not body. The second survived 23. She saw her intestines lifted and named each part as instructed. She was praised for her participation. The next morning her tongue was found nailed to the chapel door. No one spoke of her again. Magda described how mirrors were moved into different positions depending on the woman's sins. If she had lied, the mirror showed her face first. If she had stolen, it showed her hands. If she had given birth out of wedlock, it showed the space between her legs, opened and glistening beneath the light. Belgrave called it the reordering of sight. The patient was made to watch what they'd corrupted become cleansed through exposure. No cloths were allowed. Blood was part of the ceremony. After the session, if she lived, she was assigned to what he called the null wing. These were the women who had been emptied, not of organs, but of refusal. Only one had survived without breaking completely. Magda called her the blinker, but she did not blink, not anymore. Her head had been shaved to reduce distraction, her lashes removed. Her eyes held open with wax strings during the procedure had dried that way. She now sat in the attic above the chapel, in a chair with no cushion, facing a mirror that no longer reflected. She was made to watch herself every day to ensure the knowledge remained. If she flinched, a bell rang below. If the bell rang, the nurse came with saline and sharpened glass to begin another session. Magda said the blinker had once spoken, just one phrase years ago before the wax had fully hardened. She had said he never wanted answers, only obedience. The inspector returned to the estate in the dead of night. He did not ask to be let in. He climbed through the side window into the chapel, moved with the quiet of someone no longer afraid of being seen. He ascended the stairs, pushed open the attic door, and found her there. A body still alive, hollow and still. Her eyes were white in the dim, clouded with dust, but locked open. Her breath shallow. A mirror before her covered in a linen that fluttered slightly in the draught. He reached to lift the cloth, but her chest rose sharply, a sound like a warning. He stopped. She exhaled. Her eyes didn't move. She was not looking at him. She was looking past him. Downstairs, a soft chime rang, the same bell Magda had described. The inspector descended quickly, but the hallway was empty. The nurse was gone. The doors to the reflection suite were locked once more. He pressed his ear to the wall. No screams, just breathing, slow and practiced. He did not report the visit. He did not mention the attic. Instead, he wrote a single line in his ledger. They are made to watch because Belgrave never stops seeing. That night, sleep did not come. When his eyes closed, he saw his own reflection, arms spread, chest opened, and mirrors tilting around him in slow orbit. He was not screaming. He was silent, watching, as if part of him had already joined them, already learning the ritual, already seeing himself from the inside. The rain had come hard, that week, without warning or wind, falling straight and fast for days until the ground behind the Belgrave estate softened and split. The field was known as the servants' lot, once used to stable horses, now barren. But on the third morning after the water finally receded, a groundskeeper found something in the mud. Not wood, not brick, but a cluster of small bones tangled in roots. The inspector arrived before noon. By then, 6 sets had surfaced. By dusk, they had uncovered 17. Each skeleton was between the size of a child's cradle and a schoolhouse bench. The hands were folded, the limbs were whole, but every skull bore a perfect hole, not shattered, not broken, but bored through cleanly with a method no animal would know. He called for laborers to dig deeper. They found no coffins, no linen, no signs of illness or infection. The bones were stacked in diagonal rows beneath just 4 inches of soil. The deaths had not been accidental nor secret. They had simply been placed with care and forgotten with time. On one wrist, a copper tag remained, marked with the number 26 and the letter G. The inspector returned to the hospital with the tag in his coat. He asked the nurse for the servant roster. She said the hospital had never employed children. He asked about caravans of orphans from the war, the ones transported by train and cart from burned towns. She said none had come this far south. He asked to see the western wing. She said it was under repair. He entered anyway. The west wing had always been too quiet. The floors creaked differently there, as if reluctant to hold weight. Behind a false wall in the supply room, he found a second door. No knob, just a panel pressed flush with the boards. When he leaned into it, it gave way. Inside was a long hall, cold, dry, lit from above by small grated skylights that let in only thin slits of light. Along the walls were drawers, hundreds of them stacked from floor to ceiling, each labeled with a date, an emotion, and a number. Joy, 1871004. Rage, 1870089. Shame, 1869112. The drawers were narrow, no wider than a loaf of bread. He pulled one. Inside was a jar, sealed. Suspended in a yellowed solution was a small bundle of tissue, gray and folded, no bigger than a plum. Beneath it, etched into the glass, were initials. He opened 5 more. Each held a similar jar. Each jar held a portion of a child's brain, not whole, not dissected, but carefully extracted from a specific region. The temporal lobes were labeled JOY, the amygdalae, RAGE, the frontal cortices, SHAME. The jars were stored not by patient name, but by year and response. The system was not medical. It was methodological. The theory was written across the walls in fragments. Memory is liquid. Emotion is transferable weight. The mind is vessel. Belgrave had believed that the essence of experience, fear, guilt, loyalty, could be extracted like water from a sponge, preserved and studied. But to extract it, the subject had to be awake. The hole in the skull just above the temple allowed access without full penetration of the brain. A child was held steady, strapped to a frame padded with cloth soaked in belladonna and sap. Their heart rate was slowed through immersion in cold brine. Then with a drill turned slowly by hand, the bone was opened. Pressure was adjusted, a fine needle inserted. Memory, Belgrave believed, could be siphoned at the moment of recognition. That is, the moment when the child was forced to relive the most intense feeling they had ever known. The process was always fatal. But not immediately. The child would survive the procedure for hours, some days. They were not buried until the solution stopped changing color. In the corner of the west wing was a chalkboard, faded, smudged, a lesson half erased. Written beneath the curve of the last equation were 3 words: "They remember different." Halverston left the jars where they were. He sealed the door again. But he could not seal what had opened inside him. That night he dreamed of jars lined on his own bones, each labeled with the names of children he had passed on the road in towns he could not recall. He saw a girl holding her own brain in a bowl, asking if it could be rinsed before it was studied. He heard the voice of a boy he had never met say, "I can still feel the string." When he returned to the field the next morning, more bones had surfaced, 34 in total, each with the same hole, each with the same folding of hands. There were no names, only numbers. On the inner fence post, carved deep into the wood, were 3 marks: a line, a dot, and a spiral. The same markings found on the jar lids. He began to understand. The children had not been servants. They had been raw material. They were brought in not because they were broken, but because they had nothing left to forget. Their minds were clean of legacy, ideal for testing. The siphoning was not designed to cure anything. It was designed to copy suffering. Belgrave wanted to map the language of pain in its purest form. The inspector wrote nothing that day. He stood in the field until dark, boots sinking into soft soil, the rain threatening to return. When he looked back toward the house, the attic window was lit. Behind it, the silhouette of a small child stood still, unmoving, watching him. In its hand, a jar, and behind that jar another face appeared, taller, familiar, smiling. Belgrave, still alive, still seeing, still collecting. When Governor Adalbert Ames stepped from his coach beneath the white pillars of the Belgrave estate, the air changed. It was the kind of shift that didn't stir the leaves or darken the clouds, but slowed time, the way a courtroom grows quiet before a verdict. He had come unannounced but expected, flanked by a military aide and a woman from the Freedmen's Bureau whose eyes never stopped moving. Officially, it was an inspection. A federal response to rumors that the Belgrave facility had expanded without permission. Unofficially, it was a favor to Washington, a favor that came with silence in exchange for discretion. Ames was a military man. He had seen blood. He had seen amputations done with rusted blades and children born in the mud outside burned churches. He believed in order, in reconstruction. He believed healing required discipline. But the moment the front doors opened, he could smell something beneath the soap and boiled linen. Something sweet and sour like dried sweat sealed inside a glove. Dr. Belgrave did not meet him. The nurse welcomed them in his name and guided the group through halls that had been scrubbed so clean they seemed unused. The air was cold and even. The rooms were filled with blank beds, spotless instruments, white curtains hung with geometric precision. Everything sterile, everything empty. The nurse described treatment programs for battlefield trauma, corrective therapies for postbellum instability, and special interventions for what she called emotional deformities of the formerly enslaved. Ames stopped walking. He asked her to repeat the phrase. She did calmly, as if reciting from a pamphlet. The inspector, following behind them with his journal pressed against his chest, watched the governor's jaw tighten. He had seen this look before, not anger, but control slipping. When the aide asked to see the lower levels, the nurse hesitated, then agreed. She led them down a narrow hall toward a door marked Archive. She claimed it housed only administrative records, but the door did not open into filing cabinets. It opened into a corridor paneled in wood, lit by oil lamps that burned too clean to be unattended. Along one wall were windows, thick glass, soundproofed, fogged at the edges. Behind the glass was a room no larger than a courtroom box. Inside stood a woman in a Union uniform, torn and stained. She paced in circles, clutching a folded letter in her hand, stopping every few minutes to cry aloud into the silence. A second woman entered through a side door and screamed at her. The uniformed woman collapsed, sobbed, then stood again and began her circle once more. The second woman left. The cycle reset. The nurse explained without emotion that this was room 4, a civil correction chamber. Patients were guided to re-experience their trauma until the emotional response dulled. Success was measured by heart rate, gaze stability, and bladder control. Failure to progress resulted in transfer to the resting wing. The resting wing, they were told, administered what Belgrave called the sleep cure. Patients who resisted reenactment therapy were placed into long-term induced comas, using belladonna, forced saline purging, and a ritual of cold water flooding every 2 hours to prevent full cerebral stagnation. Bodies were turned regularly. Joints were braced with salt to prevent spiritual curvature. They were kept alive indefinitely. Some had not blinked in 9 years. The aide asked to see the intake records. The nurse refused. The woman from the bureau stepped forward but said nothing. She only looked at the governor, and the governor said they should continue. In a side room marked Classification, the aide found the ledger. It had been left open on the desk as if waiting. The top of the page bore a title written in Latin, then crossed out. Beneath, a heading in English. Project Fractured Line. The entries beneath were sorted by date, followed by location, trauma type, and resolution status. Each name bore a signature of approval. On page 3, halfway down the column, was Governor Ames's signature. The aide froze. The governor asked what he'd found. The aide turned the page instead. Later, as the inspection ended and the governor's coat was returned to him, he asked a single question. How many were classified as unrecoverable? The nurse answered plainly. 79. When asked how many had entered the program, she said over 400. He did not request to meet Belgrave. He did not mention the ledger. On the ride back to town, he sat with his hand pressed flat against his thigh. The aide did not speak. The woman from the bureau folded her report and stared out the window. That night, the inspector walked the grounds alone. He stood outside room 4 and watched the woman begin her loop again, her scream now hoarse, her hands shaking but still holding the folded letter. He returned to his quarters and found a file beneath his pillow. It bore his name. Inside were 5 pages detailing observations made over the past 2 weeks, each note ending with a code, REC 05, DFR 11, SLT 03. On the last page, the word pre-reconcile was stamped in red. He looked out the window and saw the chapel light flicker. He saw the boy with wax on his nails sweeping the gravel with a broom too short for his height. And in the reflection of the glass, he saw his own face. Eyes wide, mouth open, body still. Belgrave's system did not punish. It converted. It did not seek truth. It rehearsed obedience until the subject forgot they were ever different. Trauma was not a wound to heal, but a shape to be carved and filed. And the state, desperate to reclaim order, had signed its name to the design. The inspector did not sleep. He lay awake, counting his own breath, timing his blinks, pressing his fingers to his chest in intervals. He wondered how long he had already been inside the program. How many times he had already woken up inside the same day. They found the iron box behind the plaster wall of the north corridor, 2 feet deep, exactly where the plan said nothing should be. The wall had buckled slightly during a flood, and when the inspector pressed his palm to the swollen panel, the hollow beneath it answered like a chest cavity long unopened. He returned that night alone, when the halls fell quiet and the nurse's lantern no longer passed his door. The plaster crumbled easily, too easily, revealing rusted rivets and a hinge sealed with melted wax. The box was bolted into the stone foundation. It took him over an hour to open, and when he did, the smell crawled out first, not of rot, but of wet metal and mildewed cloth. Inside was a man folded in half, knees to chest, arms crossed at the wrists with wire still biting into the bone. His mouth was open, his eyes were gone, his skin gray with age but not decomposed, as though something in the box had slowed time. His fingernails were gone, snapped or torn from the bed down to soft flesh etched with faint linear grooves. On closer inspection, the inspector saw that each groove formed a sequence, dots and dashes carved into skin, a record made not with ink, but pain. His teeth bore the same marks, tiny Morse code messages scratched into enamel, some letters repeating again and again as if he'd run out of time before completing the final thought. The inspector took the first message and traced it. Translated, it read, "No echo, only return." The next, etched on a molar, read, "One sound played again and again." And then deeper in the jawline, 3 voices, one mine, one mother's, one burned. The records listed him as Harlan Tooley, a former Confederate telegraph operator reported missing in 1866. He had been listed as a deserter after disappearing from a rehabilitation camp in Alabama. The last known letter from his family begged for news. No reply had ever been sent. What remained of the man had been preserved in silence, but his body told everything. His ears had been drilled at the base, not through the canal, but directly into the temporal bone. The tissue there had been replaced with hardened material, not wood, not wax, bone. Thin, polished pieces of human ossicle shaped into narrow cones and fixed with glue. The inspector recognized them from Belgrave's theory notebooks. Bone resonance chambers, a design meant to filter emotion through memory. The idea was to play a subject's worst memory on repeat until the body stopped reacting, until emotion detached entirely from language. This was not about punishment. This was refinement. The man had been placed in the box for weeks, maybe longer. 3 sound tubes had been inserted, one for each ear and one beneath the jawline, angled toward the throat. The records revealed a plan. Record the death screams of 3 known figures in the patient's life, a mother, a lover, a commander, and play them simultaneously while the subject transmitted routine messages in Morse. These messages would be neutral, factual, designed to force cognitive separation. Orders like rations received, rain expected, unit repositioned. Every time he hesitated, the volume increased. The scratching of his nails became his only outlet. The inspector found on the final phalanx a single phrase barely visible under dried blood. God is wrong. It wasn't blasphemy. It was a conclusion. Belgrave's notes described it as cognitive purification therapy, a method for breaking the last thread between logic and grief. He believed that grief corrupted decision-making, that war would never end until men could separate fact from memory. He tested the method only on those who had been trained to communicate emotion through code. Operators, men who had used signal to bridge the living and the dead. The message never stopped. Even in death, the man's fingers were curled in a tapping position. One shoulder dislocated, the bone ground down by friction from repetition. His ribs showed no sign of external trauma, but the lungs beneath were brittle, crystallized from the salt that had been slowly fed through the breathing tube during the last stage. The final note in the therapy log said, "Subject ceased transmission during overlap trial. Attempted prayer began, session terminated." The inspector stood over the open box until the air in the corridor began to still. Behind him, faintly, a tapping, not from the wall but from within himself. He pressed his fingers against the stone and felt nothing. But in his teeth, a pressure built, a low-frequency buzz as if sound had embedded itself into bone. That night he placed his hand in a bowl of water and waited. No ripples, no sound. But in his skull, a phrase repeated, "Return, return, return." He knew then that Belgrave's cruelty wasn't arbitrary. It was purposeful, systemic. Each method fed the next. The inverted crucifixions tore confession from the throat. The reflective vivisections crushed denial. The siphoned children fed the theory of memory fluidity. And now, this. This was the bridge, the final tool in converting suffering into utility. Death was not an ending in Belgrave's system, it was data. Harlan Tooley had not died screaming. He had died transmitting pain until the signal dissolved. In the file room that night, the inspector tore the page from the ledger bearing Tooley's name. He did not destroy it. He placed it in his own journal, folded tight. Later, he found ink in his coat pocket he didn't remember bringing. He looked up to find the boy again, standing at the edge of the corridor, watching. In his hand, a small metal tapper. He held it up and let it drop once. Dot pause, dash. A single letter, I. The inspector did not answer. Not yet. But he knew when the next sound came he would, because Belgrave had already begun the experiment on him. And now the only question left was how many messages he would be forced to send before someone remembered his name. She was found inside the chapel piano during the second week of April, when the key cover slipped open during a storm and the organist, long absent, sent word that something inside had moved. The inspector arrived before the nurse could dismiss it. The piano had not been played in years, but the strings still hummed with faint memory, vibrating slightly when the wind pressed through the chapel rafters. Inside the belly of the instrument, beneath a layer of cloth and twisted wire, lay a girl. She was not dead. She did not speak. She did not blink. Her skin was the color of bleached bone, pale and tight across a frame too light to have aged naturally. Her lips were slightly parted and her breath came in shallow, nearly invisible pulses. The moment the inspector stepped forward, her body tensed, not in fear but in recognition. And then, almost imperceptibly, she trembled. The piano responded with a high, ghost-thin hum. One string, one note. Her arms were bound at the elbows, but not in restraint, in posture. Her fingers were curled in the shape of prayer. Her spine was perfectly straight, her head gently tilted. Her eyes did not track. They remained fixed on a stained glass window that hadn't caught sun in a decade. The surgeon's notes, buried in the chapel's vestry behind hymnals too old to use, revealed the design. Belgrave believed that purity amplified pain, that in innocence suffering reached a higher pitch, something closer to revelation. He had selected the girl from a group of silent orphans brought from a burned convent in Georgia. She had been mute from birth, unmarred by speech, and he described her as clean in voice and posture. She was to him an instrument. Her tendons had been cut at the base of the spine, then rerouted through experimental grafts that fused with sound wires. Thin brass filaments ran from her spinal column into her ribs and legs, pulled tight through tuning forks mounted inside the pew beneath the piano. When sound entered the room, a cough, a footstep, a breath held too long, her nerves would fire, not with motion but with vibration. She would hum faintly internally, the pitch depending on the frequency of intrusion. It was not music. It was surveillance through agony. He had written that when she responded to footsteps, he felt the presence of something divine. That when she shook beneath the weight of quiet prayers, she transcended understanding. Her purpose was not to speak or scream, but to suffer clearly so others might see their reflection. The inspector reached toward her face once and her jaw twitched, not in fear, in calibration. A small sound rang through the strings, not a note, but the echo of touch. She had been made to resonate, not react. He stepped back and felt for the first time the boundary between human and object collapse in front of him. From that moment on, she became his obsession. He visited the chapel each night, standing silently until she quivered. Her stillness became a measure. When she shook, he knew something had entered him that could not be removed. She was not alive in the ordinary way. She was memory in form, carved and rewired to reflect harm with no voice to resist. Behind the altar, he found her name scratched into wood. Not by her, but by someone who had tried to remember. Madame Lucette, No last name, no birth date. Only that, and beneath it a symbol. 2 circles, one within the other, with a crack through both. The nurse refused to speak of her. The staff turned away when he asked. But one janitor, drunk and near retirement, called her Marble. Said the doctor played her once a week, not with keys but with questions whispered into her ear. If she trembled, he recorded. If she didn't, he bled her behind the chapel until she did. The inspector began to dream of her, not in the piano but in a pool of glass humming beneath him while he tried to walk across it without making a sound. Every time he stepped, she shook. Every time she shook, he felt something inside his spine snap in reply. Belgrave had crafted not a girl, but a warning, a relic, a saint not of grace, but of compliance. Her pain wasn't random, it was structured, tuned, repeated until the space around it bent. The inspector understood now why she had been hidden. Not because she was a failure, but because she was proof. That pain could be calibrated. That silence could be shaped into obedience. That purity, once broken, became music too beautiful to be ignored. It began with the silence of the West Wing, not the absence of voices, but the absence of resistance. Doors that had once groaned open now stood ajar without motion. Rooms once monitored closely by nurses and aides were emptied overnight. The inspector returned from a brief trip to Jackson, where he had handed off portions of his notes to a colleague, only to find the estate unchanged in form but hollow in practice. No staff greeted him. No lamps burned. The chapel bell had not rung in 2 days. When he inquired about Dr. Aldrich Belgrave, the new matron on duty gave him a smile so polished it felt carved. She said the doctor had retired due to health. No address was available, no forwarding record filed. The estate now functioned under new supervision, though the name had not changed. St. Aurelius Medical Refuge remained intact, untouched by inquiry or consequence. He attempted to access the records room, but his badge no longer unlocked the corridor. The files he had copied, names, procedures, images, maps of the tunnels beneath the surgical suites, had all been removed from federal archives under a sealed protection act he had never heard of. The colleague he'd handed his notes to had taken sudden leave and left no forwarding contact. 1 week later, the inspector received a letter from the health committee, notifying him that his role had been suspended pending psychological evaluation. He had not filed for review. He returned one last time to the estate under false pretense, posing as a visiting inspector from Georgia. The nurse on duty, younger than the rest, allowed him entry but kept her eyes on the floor. He wandered the halls alone, noting the changes. The crucifixion frames had been removed. The chapel organ dismantled. The room of jars now served as a quiet therapy space decorated with lavender sprigs and candlelight. But beneath the floorboards, the structure remained. The walls had been repainted but not resealed. And when he pressed his ear to the stone beneath the corridor, he could still hear the breath. Slow, methodical, still learning. There were no death records, no obituaries. Belgrave had not died. He had vanished in a system that welcomed disappearance more than justice. It was only in a shipment of condemned medical texts slated for burning that the inspector found the truth. Tucked between cracked volumes of Confederate field surgery was a journal bound in skin dated 1849. The name on the spine was Dr. Marion Sims. Its pages described a theory of pain as spiritual purging. procedures done without anesthesia on enslaved women designed to test the threshold of humility through suffering. One entry bore a different hand, marginalia in black ink, neater than the rest. Pain must not only be felt, it must be seen. The initials beside the note were A. B. Belgrave had not invented his techniques. He had inherited them, perfected them. Sims had laid the foundation for what Belgrave later called empathic reversal. The goal was never to heal, but to sculpt. To take those considered socially unstable, women, orphans, soldiers, the formerly enslaved, and fold them into structures that could endure obedience through ritualized harm. The patient was not a subject. The patient was the frame. The pain was the art. The inspector tried to publish. One newspaper agreed to serialize his findings. The first article was printed. The rest never ran. That week his apartment was searched under unknown authority, his ink destroyed, his journals shredded. 3 years later, in the asylum of Waterfield Heights, a man listed only as E. Halverston was found hanging from a pipe in the basement laundry wing. He had not been admitted through the front desk. No record of his commitment existed. The orderly on night duty claimed he had simply appeared one morning, incoherent and tapping against the stone walls in rhythmic bursts. On his back, carved through layers of skin with what appeared to be the tip of a tuning fork, were the words, "Still breathing." The doctor on site signed the death report without hesitation. The handwriting matched the sealed medical notes from Belgrave's original files. No autopsy was ordered. The body was buried on unmarked land behind the facility. 3 days later, a letter arrived for the coroner. It contained a single jar, labeled not with a name, but with the word, "Witness." The contents inside were unidentifiable, soft tissue folded, preserved. Belgrave had not needed to die. His ideas were not bound to him. They had simply been released, repackaged, renamed, rewritten. What began as cruelty hidden in science now lived inside programs that smiled and whispered about healing. The chapel at St. Aurelius was renamed the Center for Post-War Behavioral Restoration. The girl in the piano was listed as a decorative figure and removed to storage. The tuning forks were melted for scrap. The mirrors were donated to a local orphanage. But the breath beneath the stone never stopped. It waits, still, steady, rehearsing. Because the structure was never about one man. It was about a silence made strong enough to carry suffering forward generation by generation, patient by patient, without ever raising its voice. 50 years passed before anyone tried to mark the land where Belgrave once worked. By then, the hospital had been renamed twice, repurposed once, and sold 3 times under corporate charters. The chapel still stood, repainted and hung with garlands each spring, rented out for weddings. The fields where children had been buried were flattened for pasture. The barn where women were opened like books had been torn down, the stone replaced with gravel. The only part that remained untouched was the basement beneath the western wing. It had been sealed during renovations in 1892 after a foreman fell through a trapdoor and shattered his leg. He claimed before he passed from infection that the ground below whispered when he cried. In 1918, a state commission proposed a memorial to acknowledge a period of unregulated medical correction during early Reconstruction. It did not name Belgrave. It did not mention children. It did not speak of mirrors or jars or girls locked inside instruments of prayer. The language was thin, stripped of cruelty, flattened by committees that favored public dignity over public history. Survivors were contacted. Only 2 responded. One had no memory of her time there. The other refused to speak unless the chapel was burned. The motion was blocked by a private foundation. The land was ruled without lasting consequence. But the techniques did not vanish. In 1920, across the Northeast, trauma wards began to rise in newly built hospitals for war veterans and mentally unsettled immigrants. Among them was Belgrave Neurological Institute in upstate New York. The spelling had shifted, a single letter dropped, but the filing showed something deeper. A trustee listed as an heir to a southern estate. A lead physician trained in empathetic recalibration. A program titled Fracture and Renewal. Patients reported being shown images of their own injuries, forced to repeat phrases while submerged in water, kept awake for 72 hours, then plunged into sedation under noise therapy. When one nurse protested, she was reassigned. When another patient died, the body was cremated before the report could be filed. There was no outrage, no scandal. Only studies published in quiet journals, peer-reviewed by the same hands that signed the funding. A boy admitted for mutism was found years later with tremors in response to footstep rhythms. A woman who had lost her daughter in a train crash was made to reenact the screams through a glass partition, told. Her healing required dissonance exposure. An orderly who spoke out was diagnosed with paranoid delusion and hospitalized next to his former patients. When his mother visited, he whispered to her through the bars that he was being tuned. Belgrave's handwriting never appeared in these reports. But the architecture was the same, the language reused, the belief unchanged, that suffering could be molded, made obedient, stretched across decades through process, not ideology. The inspector's death had faded into rumor. His name no longer appeared in state records. His journals were cited in only one case study, filed under psychosis resulting from prolonged institutional contact. No one questioned why his body was found in a facility where he had never been admitted. No one explained how words had been carved into his back after death. But in private, among nurses who stayed too long in basement shifts and doctors who filed reports no one ever read, whispers continued. Of girls who blinked in rhythm with organ music, of mirrors removed from storage that shattered the moment sunlight touched them, of drawers once filled with tissue samples that could not be traced, labeled only by emotion. In 1923, a child patient drew a symbol on his wall with his own blood. 2 circles, one inside the other with a line through both. The staff believed it was nonsense, until a visiting intern from Mississippi froze upon seeing it. She had found the same mark carved into the back of a pew during her grandmother's funeral. The memorial was never built. The proposal was quietly dropped. The governor who had pushed for it died 2 years later in his sleep, hands curled in a tapping position, though he had never learned Morse. And still, the breath beneath the old soil remained. Even when the foundation was lifted for new construction, the workers refused to dig too deep. One shovel struck metal and the ground beneath it rang hollow. The foreman ordered the plans adjusted. A concrete slab was poured over the space and a garden was planted above it. Roses. They never bloomed. By 1925, institutions across the country adopted new words. adjustment therapy, moral alignment, compliance synthesis. The pain remained, but the purpose changed costume. Still, every few years a patient would whisper the same thing into a nurse's ear before slipping into coma. A phrase not taught, a phrase not known. God is wrong. Belgrave was never buried because he never died. Not in the legal sense, not in the institutional sense. His presence did not require body or name. It required only silence, and a structure to hold that silence long enough to be called healing. And so the story was not closed, not resolved, not condemned. It was copied, transferred, translated, and those who tried to stop it found that the system had no face, only rooms that locked behind them, mirrors that showed no reflection, and jars sealed without explanation. The boy with waxed fingernails was seen once more in 1930 outside a veterans' hospital in Kentucky. Still small, still silent, holding a tuning fork to his spine, and somewhere deep beneath concrete something still breathes. Steady, practiced, waiting. What do you think? Could this happen again, or did it never stop?